Hello everyone, my name is Holger and this is another video on the WoT Show Theory channel, which is dedicated to analysis and theory crafting about the Wheel of Time TV show. In this video I'm going to discuss Lanfear's story arc in Season 2, especially how it connects to Ishamael, Leandrin, Rand, Moiraine, Lan and Siuan. Lanfear's arc in Season 2 is particularly interesting because of the big change that happens in Episode 8. Up until Episode 7, we're meant to believe that Lanfear is simply an adversary who is personally interested in Rand, but in Episode 8 we learn that her motives, plans and actions go much deeper. In this video I take a close look at the events related to Lanfear in Season 2 with the benefit of hindsight. This means knowing where they eventually lead to at the end of the season. But first a spoiler notice. This video does not contain any book spoilers. In fact, I do not talk about the books at all in this video and do not incorporate any book knowledge into the video. If you've watched Seasons 1 and 2 of the TV show, then you should be good to watch this video. I will look at the events of the TV show mostly in chronological order, but occasionally I'll also look at story arcs across multiple points in time where useful. Let's start with what happened right after the events of Season 1, during the time jump at the beginning of Season 2. It all starts with Moiraine moving Logain from the White Tower to Cairhien, which we learn about when Lanfear tells Rand, and it is later confirmed when Rand confronts Moiraine. Siuan obviously was involved in this, because Siuan gave the original order to imprison Logain in the tower in Season 1, and Moiraine would not have been able to countermand that order, especially not after she had been exiled. Rand also found out before the beginning of the season that Logain had been taken to Cairhien. We don't know exactly how, only that Moiraine did not directly tell him, because otherwise he would not have seemed surprised about this when he later confronted Moiraine about the matter. Since Moiraine sent Logain to Cairhien specifically so Rand could meet him there, she must also have found some way to tell Rand indirectly, for example by making sure that Rand overhears a conversation of people talking about a false dragon being in the Cairhien sanatorium. Lanfear also found out about this, probably by Black Aja agents in the White Tower who told Ishamael, who then told Lanfear. Siuan must have told the Hall of the Tower about her plans, and once that many Aes Sedai know something, the Black Aja would surely find out. At that time Lanfear went to Cairhien, set up an inn in the Foregate in her Selene persona, and waited for Rand to come to the city. Lanfear must have somehow made contact with Rand, perhaps by offering him the cheapest room rates in the Foregate, and from that point on she started a relationship with him. After Rand had moved to Cairhien, he applied for work at the sanatorium, with the goal of eventually making contact with Logain. After that, Lanfear started the next phase of her plan, and that was to lure Moiraine to Cairhien, because Lanfear knew that she would need Moiraine late in the season for the banner weave. We don't know exactly why it was important for Lanfear to have specifically Moiraine perform that weave, and why she would not do it herself. One possibility is that Lanfear did not know the weave, perhaps because it was created after the Age of Legends in connection with one of the newer dragon prophecies. Another possibility is that Lanfear simply did not want to expose herself to the public by holding a weave for several minutes. Yet another possibility is that she was worried that if she had created the weave herself, Rand would have found out about it and would have thought that his proclamation as the Dragon Reborn had been manipulated somehow. Regardless of Lanfear's reason, it was clearly important for her that Moiraine perform that task. The way Lanfear lured Moiraine to Cairhien is by selling Bael'Dormon a piece of Quendelia, and presumably also the related prophecy poem, with the intention that Bael'Dormon sells both of them to Moiraine. We found out about all of that in Episode 8, when Lanfear talks to Bael'Dormon again. After Lanfear sold the piece of Quendelia to Bael'Dormon is when the events of Season 2 start, with multiple events happening in parallel. Bael'Dormon sees Moiraine, and Moiraine finds out that Lanfear has likely been freed from her seal. Moiraine then simply tries to leave and head for Cairhien alone late at night, leaving Lan behind. It is unfortunate timing though, because Moiraine leaves just when Lan tries to take her dinner to her. Lan then wonders where Moiraine is and eventually follows her. It still ends up lucky for Moiraine though, because Fades attack her and Lan is there right in time to save her. Moiraine then realizes that she would not be able to just leave, but has to send Lan away first. Since Lan would not leave by himself, Moiraine contacts Alanna in the White Tower, asking her to come to Tiffin's Well to take Lan away. We find out about that when Alanna talks to her warders about the need to help Moiraine. While all of that is happening, Lanfear's relationship with Rand progresses, and she tries to make herself as helpful as possible to Rand. For example, when she finds a way to get a special bottle of red wine for him at a party. This is a bottle that Logain has asked for and that Rand later takes to Logain. Next we have the first complication in Lanfear's plans, and this is when Rand accidentally burns down Lanfear's inn. Lanfear pretends that she does not know how it happened and does not blame Rand. Instead, she takes Rand to a cabin in the countryside. This whole time, Lanfear has been waiting for Moiraine to arrive, but Moiraine was of course delayed because she had to find a way to leave Lan behind first. That finally happens when Alanna arrives and takes Lan away. Moiraine then heads for Cairhien and arrives there right after the inn burned down and Rand and Lanfear left, and talks to different people, including Anwer, Celestine, and Loghain, where she finds out where Rand stayed. After talking to a guard, she then again talks to Anwer, and presumably then finally gets a hint where Rand has gone. Moiraine does eventually get to the cabin where Rand and Lanfear have been staying, attacks Lanfear, and runs away with Rand. From that point on, viewers are supposed to believe that Lanfear sees Moiraine as an adversary and wants to kill her, but there are small hints sprinkled throughout the season that this is not true, and we finally get explicit confirmation for this in episode 8. Lanfear has to keep two delicate balances throughout the season, one related to Moiraine and one related to Rand. Moiraine believes that Lanfear wants to kill her, and Lanfear has to play into that, because otherwise Moiraine would think that she's being manipulated. However, since Lanfear does not actually want to kill Moiraine, she has to be careful to never come face to face with Moiraine alone. Rand always has to be with Moiraine when Lanfear is there, so that Rand always gets a chance to ask Lanfear to leave Moiraine alone. The other balance is how Lanfear manages the relationship between Rand and Moiraine. Lanfear wants Rand to somewhat trust Moiraine, because Lanfear needs Moiraine to stay involved, so Lanfear can use Moiraine later. However, Lanfear can never actually tell Rand to trust Moiraine, because that would make both Rand and Moiraine suspicious. Lanfear has to tell Rand to stay away from Moiraine, so Rand thinks that Lanfear considers Moiraine an enemy, but the threat has to be somewhat half-hearted, so Rand can ignore it. And of course, Lanfear needs to ensure that Rand trusts her at least somewhat, and more importantly, recognizes that Lanfear is important to him and can be very helpful, more than Moiraine. We see all of these dynamics play out throughout the season, and Lanfear is extremely skilled at manipulating both Rand and Moiraine. Back to the events. Rand and Moiraine run away from Lanfear, clearly expecting that Lanfear follows them with the intent to kill Moiraine. Moiraine tries to slow Lanfear down by denying her access to a horse, but that does not really work in the end, because Lanfear quickly finds another horse. Moiraine then lays a false trail for Lanfear by asking the stablemaster to ride ahead to Valon, while Rand and Moiraine stay behind, hidden in the underbrush. The trick works. Lanfear rides past them and eventually reaches the stablemaster, who, against Moraine's instructions, has rested the horses early. Lanfear suspects that this is part of a false trail that Moiraine has set for her, but wants to make sure, so she asks whose idea it was, and gets confirmation that Moiraine was behind it. What happens next is the first clear indication that viewers get that Lanfear is not actually trying to chase down Moiraine and Rand, but only play acting, to ensure that Moiraine feels threatened by Lanfear. The way we can tell is by looking at the direction Lanfear is riding after talking to the stablemaster. She continues to ride in the same direction as before, as we can tell from the fact that the horses are standing on the same side of the road. This means Lanfear did not double back to get back to Rand and Moiraine. Lanfear continued on to Valon. Moiraine now thinks that her ruse has worked. This means that Lanfear fell for the trick and continued all the way to Valon. In reality, Lanfear never wanted to chase down Moiraine and Rand in the first place, and she now just waits for Rand to go to sleep so she can talk to Rand in his dreams. Moiraine and Rand arrive in Cairhien, disheveled and exhausted, assuming that Lanfear is still pursuing them, and that they need to leave as soon as possible. Then Moiraine talks to Anwer and changes her mind, thinking that Rand perhaps does not need to be protected, and that it would be better for Rand to try to manipulate Lanfear to provide information. Rand agrees, finally falls asleep, and meets Lanfear in his dreams, with Rand being shackled to a giant wheel. Lanfear's goal at this point is to set up the new dynamics of her relationship with Rand and Moiraine, now that her Selene disguise no longer works. At first she just defines the basics by telling Rand that she has been protecting him from Ishamael and that Moiraine has manipulated him all along. As evidence, she finally gives him a piece of information that she has known for months but has strategically held back until the right moment, and that is that Moiraine was responsible for Loghain being sent to Cairhien. Now Rand sees his chance and pretends that he's open to trusting her, but only if Lanfear does something to earn it, so he asks her to tell him what Ishamael is planning. Of course, Lanfear has already seen right through this, realizing that Moiraine and Rand are trying to play her. From Lanfear's point of view, this is the best thing that could have happened. Lanfear was probably worried how she would be able to control Rand again and get him to trust her after her Selene disguise was uncovered. And now Rand himself comes asking for information and cooperation. Lanfear agrees, but states one condition, and that is for Rand to stay away from Moiraine, as we later find out. Of course, Lanfear never expected Rand to actually do that. The reason why she sets that condition is simply because she knows that Rand would tell Moiraine about that condition, and Moiraine would then know that Lanfear is ready to work with Rand, but not with Moiraine. This again only has the purpose of making sure that Moiraine does not feel manipulated by Lanfear. Lanfear has now achieved what she wanted, and that is for Rand to be open to cooperate with her, and for Moiraine to think that Lanfear is still threatening to kill her. It is now time for Lanfear to start the next phase of her plan, and that is to take Rand to Falme. For that, she first has to give Rand a reason why he would want to go to Falme, because if Rand goes willingly, that makes things so much easier for Lanfear. In the next dream, Lanfear again tries to hammer home the notion that Ishamael is Rand's enemy, and that Lanfear is trying to protect Rand from Ishamael.
Is she, dear? If he doesn't want you to be here, then you shouldn't be. I told you I was protecting you from him.
After that, she gives Rand the piece of information that makes him want to go to Falme, and that is the fact that Ishamael, who she has just portrayed as Rand's enemy, is holding Egwene in Falme. In principle, everyone is now ready to go to Falme, but suddenly two complications come up in quick succession. The first one is that Min and Mat have finally arrived in Cairhien. This is part of Ishamael's plan, not Lanfear's, and the idea is for Mat to get together with Rand in Cairhien and eventually push Rand to the dark, or potentially kill him. Mat and Rand do reunite and plan to go to Falme together to free Egwene, but when Mat returns to Min, she changes her mind and tells Mat about how he has been lured to Cairhien and that he will eventually kill Rand. Mat does not go back to Rand. Because of that, Ishamael no longer sees any value in having Mat in Cairhien and now switches to plan B, and that is to bring Mat to Falme so he can be re-addicted to the dagger. Apparently, Ishamael asked Lanfear to bring Mat, and Lanfear agreed because that way Ishamael owes her a favor. Also, from Lanfear's point of view, there's no downside to taking Mat away from Cairhien. He could have caused problems for Lanfear there by interfering with her plans for Rand. The other much bigger sudden complication is Siuan's arrival in Cairhien, along with 14 Aes Sedai. First, let's look at how Siuan's arrival in Cairhien actually happened. It starts with Lan wondering what Moiraine is hiding from him and searching Moraine's saddlebags, where he finds the prophecy poem. After Lan is sent away from Moiraine, Lan bizarrely makes the exact same mistake as Moiraine and leaves the same poem in his saddlebags, where Maxim and Alanna find it. Then Alanna and her warders suspect Lan of being a dark friend, especially after he decides to leave them in the middle of the night to go to Siuan and tell her about Moraine's stilling. Lan then apparently feels that he needs to tell Alanna all of his life's secrets, including the Dragon Reborn conspiracy he has with Moiraine and Siuan, and the group finally goes to Siuan, where Lan ends up meeting her. This is a rather strange sequence of events, so I don't think it was the result of Lanfear's or anyone else's deliberate planning. Siuan's reason for going to Cairhien is probably not Moraine's stilling, but the fact that the Dragon Reborn conspiracy has now leaked to more people, including Alanna, Ivan, and Maxim. Technically also to Verin, who we earlier found out knows about Moiraine having found the dragon, but Siuan probably does not know that. Leaks like that are a real danger to Siuan, because eventually the wrong person will find out, and the whole of the tower will start asking questions about Siuan's role in the matter, which could very easily lead to Siuan being deposed and stilled. My guess is that the original reason for Siuan to come to Cairhien was not that she wanted to take Rand away from Moiraine, but rather that she wanted Rand to be proclaimed a dragon immediately in Cairhien, to make sure that Rand's identity is no longer part of a conspiracy, and to give the Hall of the Tower more important tasks to deal with than looking into potential conspiracies in the past. Lanfear likely knew about Siuan's arrival a little ahead of time, because Leandrin is one of those 14 Aes Sedai that came with Siuan, and Leandrin would probably have told Ishamael and Lanfear through her Black Archer connection. It must be clear to Lanfear that Siuan coming to Cairhien is not a coincidence, but is related to Rand, which presents a serious problem for Lanfear, because Lanfear sure does not want those 14 Aes Sedai anywhere near Rand. They would not only be dangerous to Lanfear herself, but would also make it much harder for Lanfear to keep influencing Rand. So Lanfear must have come up with some kind of plan for dealing with this situation. I'll get to that in a moment. The first immediate effect of Siuan arriving in Cairhien is that Lan and Alanna's group stop Rand from getting onto a ship to Falme. Beyond that, they lead to a series of meetings in a throne room in the Sun Palace of Cairhien. Some of those meetings are extremely strange and make it look like Siuan is acting out of character by suddenly changing plans and suggesting that Rand should be taken to the White Tower instead of continuing to work with Moiraine. This has been discussed widely in the fanbase, and several different theories have been proposed. Lauren from Unraveling the Pattern summarized them very nicely in his episode 7 review video. What I will try to do here is look at those meetings Siuan has in Cairhien in more detail to see if we can come up with a definitive answer for what actually happened here. This means which theory is correct. Here are the 3 theories. The first theory is the honesty theory. Siuan might have really changed her mind. This means recent events may have convinced her that the plan she has been following with Moiraine has failed, and that Rand should now be taken to the tower. The second theory is the ruse theory. Siuan and Moiraine might be putting on a show, a kind of good cop, bad cop routine for an audience, to continue the ruse that they are enemies, while secretly still working on a common plan to deal with Rand. The third theory is the compulsion theory. Siuan might be under compulsion and forced to act strangely for the benefit of whoever has put Siuan under compulsion. So let's look at all of those scenes one by one to see if they support any of those theories. The first scene is the only one in which Siuan's behavior is exactly as we would expect. It is the scene in which Siuan and Moiraine first meet during Siuan's visit. Siuan shows empathy for Moraine's apparent stilling and asks her why she did not tell Siuan about it. Siuan likely knows why, though. The failure at the Eye of the World was largely Siuan's fault, because Siuan misinterpreted one of her own dreams and then sent Moiraine to the Eye with bad instructions, which led to the failure. Siuan probably already feels guilty about that, and if Moiraine had told Siuan that Siuan's mistake also caused Moiraine to be stilled, that would only have made Siuan feel even worse. At the end of the scene, Siuan tells Moiraine that she now intends to share the burden of handling Rand with Moiraine. She could not do that earlier because of the need for secrecy, but once Rand has proclaimed himself to be the dragon, Siuan would have the opportunity to take a much more active role, and Siuan is clearly promising that here. She also confirms that she wants Moiraine to continue to work on this mission. Next, there's a scene between Siuan and Rand. It starts off by Rand complaining about being a spoke in the wheel, and Siuan responding that he's not a spoke in the wheel, but the water that turns the wheel itself. That by itself is already unusual. The idea of Rand being a spoke in the wheel makes sense, and is probably what Moiraine has told him. It expresses that Rand is important, but not the only person of importance, and that he needs help and guidance from others. That's exactly the kind of mindset that the Blue Archer would want to instill in Rand. Siuan's expression sounds like Rand is the only person that matters, and that he can make all decisions by himself, without guidance, being the literal force behind creation. This builds up Rand's ego, but really is not helpful in guiding Rand. Then we have a series of statements from Siuan that make Rand increasingly angry and that suggest that Siuan may want to take Rand to the tower against his will and force him to obey Aes Sedai there. Siuan's statements are full of Aes Sedai word trickery. For example, she uses expressions like Tower Law says and we are meant to, not we will, when talking about what they will do to Rand. This suggests that Siuan may not actually intend to do any of the things she is threatening Rand with, and that she may be using Aes Sedai word trickery only to allow her to bypass the First Oath. However, we cannot be sure of that. What is interesting here is the choice of threats: imprisonment, shielding from the One Power, controlling when and what Rand may channel, using him as a weapon in battle, treating him as a tool, a weapon instead of a person, and denying him the decision of whom and how to fight. All of these threats are almost identical to how among the Seanchan Sodam treated Amani. From an out-of-story perspective, it looks like the writers deliberately placed these threats from Siuan in the episode immediately after the one that dealt with Egwene's treatment by Rhaena to point out the parallels. Rand's perception is that Siuan is threatening him with enslavement, and I'm sure this is intentional on Siuan's part. Even though technically Siuan does not actually make any of these threats, because she uses Aes Sedai word trickery, Rand is not experienced enough to make that distinction, and Siuan knows that, of course. Siuan knows exactly what the effects of her words will be when she says them. Rand eventually states, "I won't live in your cage," in a much more hostile tone than before, and embraces saidin. He does not channel, though. Immediately afterwards, Siuan attacks Rand with a weave of air, throwing him back and shielding him. She then expresses frustration that Rand, in her words, has learned nothing. That statement, of course, makes no sense. First, Siuan purposefully provokes Rand to become angry. Then he does and embraces saidin, which Siuan cannot see. This means Siuan can only go by Rand's angry tone of voice and facial expression. She then immediately attacks and shields him, which Rand cannot see. What was he supposed to do? It is extremely difficult, bordering impossible, for a male channeler to defend against that kind of attack from a female channeler, since a male channeler cannot see it, and he had no reason to assume that Siuan would outright attack him. Rand's only other option would have been to be the one to attack first, but he can hardly be expected to do that during the audience with the Emerald Seat. The bottom line is that Siuan never gave Rand any chance whatsoever to show whether he has learned anything or not. For her to simply claim that he has not learned anything is completely ridiculous and disingenuous. Siuan did not even try to get any information about Rand's abilities in that scene, and Rand even sensed that earlier when he stated, "This is not a conversation, you already made your decision, you made it before you ever met me." Rand is absolutely correct here, and Siuan does not even deny it. So what was the whole point of the meeting then? Certainly not fact-finding. The point seems to have been to make Rand angry and give Siuan a pretext to attack and shield Rand, nothing more. So then let's look at our three theories and see how well they fit. First, the theory that Siuan really wants to take Rand to the tower. Threatening him with enslavement and making him angry does not seem like a good strategy for that, regardless of what Siuan's plans are. Even if she somehow can get him to the tower and force him to train, she would eventually have to unshield him, otherwise he would not be able to fight in the last battle, and as soon as that happens, he would lash out against the other Aes Sedai, and Siuan would have a lot of dead and stilled Aes Sedai on her hands. Not the best strategy. What Siuan should be doing here is point out all of the advantages that the tower has. For example, that it can protect him from the Forsaken, and that it has a giant library. Rand could probably find some information on saidin there, on the Forsaken, on the progression of madness in male channelers, and on dragon prophecies. Siuan could even offer to give Rand a couple of Brown Archer sisters as research assistants. That seems like a much better way to get Rand to cooperate than enslaving him. So I think we can rule out the first theory. If Siuan really wanted to take Rand to the tower, then she would approach that very differently. The other reason why this theory would not work is because Siuan just a moment earlier told Moiraine that she wanted to work together with Moiraine. Did she just change her mind right now without any new information? Then there's the ruse theory. This means the assumption that Siuan and Moiraine are secretly cooperating. That means Siuan does not really want to take Rand to the tower. She only pretends to want that, and that she still secretly works with Moiraine. Whatever the real plan for Rand is, it would have to be outside of the tower. The problem with this is, why threaten to enslave Rand? Isn't that taking things too far, even if she does not really mean it? It would lead to Rand not trusting any Aes Sedai, which would become a problem if anything were to ever happen to Moiraine, and Siuan needed to assign another Aes Sedai to Rand. I'll mark Rue's theory as very unlikely for now. A bit later we will get to another scene that illustrates that Rue's theory really does not work at all, in any variation of it. Next, there's the compulsion theory. This one actually works really well. The idea is that Lanfear has Siuan under compulsion because Lanfear wants to make sure that Moiraine and Siuan do not work together and do not come up with any plan that results in Siuan and her 14 Aes Sedai going with Rand. Specifically, the compulsion would contain the following elements. First, Siuan is compelled to anger and provoke Rand so much that a rift is created between him and the White Tower. The main purpose of this is to ensure that Rand would never tolerate Siuan or her 14 Aes Sedai next to him voluntarily. The second purpose is to alienate Rand from the tower long term, because that way it will be easier for Lanfear to control him in the future without competition from the tower. Second, Siuan is compelled to imprison Rand at the end of their meeting. Again, there are two reasons for this. It follows through on Siuan's earlier threat, and it creates a gender-reversed damsel in distress situation, which then allows Lanfear to turn into the knight in shining armor who rescues Rand, so she can once again prove how useful she is to him. Also note that nobody else is in the room while Siuan talks to Rand. This is part of the compulsion, and is because any other Aes Sedai in the room would immediately see how unreasonable Siuan is behaving with the threat of enslavement, and would suspect foul play of some kind. With the compulsion theory, the Aes Sedai word trickery Siuan uses is a slightly different reason than usual. Without compulsion, such trickery usually happens because the person speaking wants to say something that their first oath does not allow, so the person has to work around it. In this case, with compulsion, the conflict is between what compulsion makes a person say versus what the first oath allows, so it is a slightly different conflict than usual. Let's move on to the next scene. Here Moiraine walks in and Siuan allows her to do so. This means the conversation with Siuan and Moiraine takes place with Rand still in the room, listening in. This is important, and I'll get to that in a moment. The first important part of this scene is that Siuan is again using Aes Sedai word trickery. In their first exchange, Siuan states that she intends to obey Tower law, but she never says that she's referring to the part of the law that talks about the Dragon Reborn. She could be referring to any other part of Tower law which Siuan may have been ignoring over the last few years. Then Moiraine suggests that Siuan's behavior may lead to Rand being gentled by the Red Archer, and Moiraine of course means that this would happen if Siuan takes Rand to the White Tower. Siuan's response is, "Not while I hold the seat," which also has two possible meanings. It could mean exactly what Moiraine reads into it. This means that Siuan wants to take Rand to the tower, and that Siuan feels that she's so strong that she could prevent the Reds from gentling Rand. However, it could also mean that Siuan does not intend to take Rand to the tower while she holds the seat, and that therefore the Reds would not get an opportunity to gentle Rand. When Moiraine objects and asks Siuan whether she is really so sure of her power, Siuan does not respond. This further suggests that the second interpretation is likely correct. Siuan makes a few more arguments, all of which seem disingenuous. First, she claims that Moiraine was supposed to shield Rand if he goes mad, and that she cannot do that now since she's stilled. That argument makes no sense, because a single Aes Sedai would never have been able to shield the Dragon Reborn in his full power anyway. Moiraine would always have needed help, and that part has not changed due to her stilling. I have already commented on her argument that Rand is no more ready now than he was before Moiraine found him. Siuan has no way of knowing that, and she has made no attempt to find out. The only part of her speech that rings true and does not contain Aes Sedai word trickery is that she intends to have him proclaim the Dragon Reborn in Cairhien, which is why she came to Cairhien. So if you remember that Siuan just a moment earlier told Moiraine, "From here on out I row beside you," suggesting that she wants to continue their common plan, from this scene it is at least possible that she does not want to take Rand to the tower, but only have him proclaim the Dragon Reborn in Cairhien. This means to go public with his identity, and that also fits very well with the compulsion theory. Here's how. The third part of Siuan's compulsion is to reject and obstruct any plan that Moiraine comes up with, so the two of them do not end up working together. And again, there are two reasons why Lanfear would want that. The first reason is that it forces Moiraine to execute her plan on her own, without Siuan and her 14 Aes Sedai, which is exactly what Lanfear wants. Second, Rand is listening in on their conversation, and he sees Moiraine fight with Siuan. Since Siuan is already Rand's enemy after the previous scene, and Moiraine now fights with her, Rand probably feels that Moiraine is on his side, according to the principle that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So that is my explanation of why Siuan behaves so strangely. Lanfear found out that Siuan was coming to Cairhien, and she saw the threat caused by Siuan and her 14 Aes Sedai somehow becoming involved in the plan of taking Rand to Falme and having him proclaim himself there. So Lanfear put Siuan under compulsion to ensure that rifts open up between Siuan and Rand, and also between Siuan and Moiraine, to ensure that Moiraine does not try to cooperate with Siuan and her 14 Aes Sedai in any plan that involves Rand. There's another hint that Siuan's behavior may be because of compulsion, and that is because the word compulsion has been mentioned in the show twice before, both times in episode 5, and both times in ways that seemed a bit strange. The first time was in a dialogue between Verin and Jessica. Here Verin jumped from "Sheriam's handwriting is jittery" straight to "Sheriam was under compulsion." That's quite a leap, because there are several other much simpler explanations for jittery handwriting. An obvious one is low blood sugar, so Sheriam may simply have been hungry. The other incident is also unusual, and it happens when Lanfear and Ishamael talk about the other Forsaken, and Lanfear states that the boys couldn't execute a plan even if they were under compulsion. Lanfear clearly tries to express that in her view the boys are incompetent, but then why add the line even if they were under compulsion? If one of the boys were under compulsion and then was unable to execute a plan, the fault would at least partially lie with the person who put the boy under compulsion, not the boy himself, so that line about compulsion really weakens Lanfear's argument. Both of those compulsion name drops feel somewhat shoehorned into the story, so we have to wonder if the reason why they were added was simply to mention the concept of compulsion in the show, not that they were necessarily needed in those scenes. I think the real reason for those name drops is that Siuan will later be under compulsion, and that the mystery surrounding Siuan's unusual behavior was not resolved at the end of Season 2. This means it will persist across season boundaries. If the show had not mentioned compulsion before that, then that mystery would have been unfair to non-book readers, because without knowing that compulsion exists in the show, non-book readers would have no way of solving the mystery before Season 3. Yet another potential hint at compulsion is Sophie Quineto's acting style in those scenes. Her facial acting and body acting both seem different from how we have seen them in previous scenes, more impatient and much more expressive, but this is difficult to pin down precisely. Two variations of the compulsion scenario are possible. First of all, the Forsaken responsible for the compulsion could also have been Ishamael, because his motives are similar to Lanfear's, in the sense that he also wants Rand to eventually come to Falme without 14 Aes Sedai. Lanfear seems more likely, though, because Lanfear has been much more fixated on Rand and the people around Rand than Ishamael. The other possible variation is that the compulsion may not have been performed by Lanfear herself, but by Leandrin, ordered by one of the Forsaken. Leandrin would have had that opportunity because she was one of the 14 Aes Sedai who came with Siuan. Still, I think it is more likely that one of the Forsaken is responsible, because compulsion is so powerful that I don't think the show is likely to give that ability to ordinary Black Archer sisters, at least at this early stage. Overall, I think it is most likely that Lanfear performed the compulsion herself, especially because Swan's line about Rand being the water that turns the wheel itself fits Lanfear's philosophy and goals so perfectly. Let's go back to the main storyline. After the scenes with Swan, Rand finds himself imprisoned. The next night, Lanfear appears in his dreams again, already aware of Rand's situation. She taunts him, asking him why he does not ask Moiraine for help, again hammering home the idea that Lanfear is more useful to him than Moiraine. She does finally agree to free him, though. The next day, Lanfear comes into the foregate, creating chaos in the form of fire and explosions, to eventually draw Swan and other Aes Sedai out, away from Rand. She then blows up the city gate, and presumably continues to the Sun Palace from there in order to free Rand. That does not happen, though, because Moiraine has formed her own small coalition of Aes Sedai and warders who help her free Rand, including Veron and Alana. Both of them found out earlier that Rand is the Dragon Reborn. Veron uses Aes Sedai word trickery to have Lyanna transfer Rand's shield over to her and then freeze Rand. Veron had earlier received an Ogier map from Jessica that shows the location of the Kareen Waygate, so Moiraine, Lan, and Rand can now make their way to that Waygate. At this point we get another very unusual event, and that is Lan suddenly turning into the world's foremost expert on Age of Legends channeling techniques, and telling not only Moiraine that she has a tied-off shield on her, but also Rand how he can remove that shield. Where would Lan have that information from? Since that question is also apparently tied to Lanfear, I will look at it in a bit more detail. The prevailing fan theory is that Lan found out that information by studying books at Tiffin's Well, but that theory is almost certainly incorrect. First of all, it is simply not plausible that Lan, a person with no background in performing literature research, would have stumbled across information as groundbreaking as tied-off weaves in books that Veron and Adelias have been studying for decades without finding that information, especially considering that Lan had at most a few months of time. Second, if Lan had been able to find that information, he would have told Moiraine immediately. At this point in their story arc, Lan still tried to be as helpful to Moiraine as he can, even serving her meals. Lan would never have let Moiraine just send him away if he had had that kind of information to help Moiraine. So how did he get the information then? I think there are several pieces to the puzzle. At the beginning of the season, Lan thinks that the Dark One has told Moiraine, because Moiraine has not yet told him what really happened at the Eye of the World. Then there's a series of scenes in which Lan starts to slowly doubt his initial understanding of what happened. The first such scene is at Adelias and Veron's place, when Adelias and Veron explain to Lan that it is unusual for Moiraine to even have survived this long after being stilled. Sometime later, Moiraine talks to Lan about the events at the Eye of the World, and tells Lan that it was Ishamael who cut Moiraine out from the One Power, not the Dark One. Lan then states that it takes 8 Aes Sedai to do that, which is incorrect, because we know from Season 1, Episode 1, that Leandrin was able to gentle a man with only 5 Aes Sedai total. Whether Lan is right or wrong does not really matter though, only his perception that Ishamael might not have been able to do this by himself. A bit later, when Rand is with Alana's family, he talks to Maxim, and Maxim tells Lan that he has been doing really well, and that the first few weeks after a bond has been broken usually are very difficult. Lan tells Maxim that his bond has been masked for the last 6 months, and Maxim responds that his bond has been masked as well, as a matter of choice. After all of these conversations, Lan likely believes that there is really no evidence for Moiraine's stilling, and that everything could be explained simply by his bond being masked and by Ishamael somehow preventing Moiraine from channeling. Since the concept of tying off weaves has been lost after the Age of Legends and does not exist in this age yet, Lan would still have no way of coming up with any theory of what Ishamael actually did. This means what really happened to Moiraine. A bit later, on the way to Valon, Lan asks Alana whether she believes that the Forsaken have powers that the Aes Sedai have lost, so it looks like this issue has been on his mind. The phrase, "weaves this age has forgotten," indicates that at this point he still believes that Ishamael might have used a completely different weave, not an ordinary shield with the weaves tied off. This is the last point in time for which we know with high certainty that Lan does not know about tied-off weaves yet. Sometime later, after arriving in Cairhien, Lan asks Moiraine if she ever considered committing suicide. We don't know for sure whether Lan is asking this question just as part of his general research, or whether he already knows about tied-off weaves at this point, and asks Moiraine that question only to double-check whether his information is correct. My guess is the latter, because he also says, "and I hope someday you'll forgive me for asking it," and then later, "that's what I thought," which somewhat suggests that Lan already has the full picture of what happened to Moiraine. Then Lan sees Logain in a sanatorium, and specifically asks Logain whether he can see male weaves on Moiraine. That suggests that he's now no longer thinking that Ishamael had just used a different kind of weave, as Lan thought earlier, but Lan now has apparently been told about the concept of tied-off weaves. He asks how is that possible near the end, so he still has a hard time believing it, probably because it goes against everything he has been told all of his life. There is one more event between Lan's arrival in Cairhien and Lan going to the sanatorium, and that is Lan talking to Alanna. We see that when Maxim waits for Alanna to return, and then Lan and Alanna arrive together. We don't know for sure what Lan and Alanna talked about before they arrived, except for 2 items. Lan confirmed to Alanna that Lanfear is indeed free, probably after Moiraine told him. Up until this point, Lan and Alanna had only suspected Lanfear to be free, based on that poem, but not known for sure. Also, Lan must have told Alanna that he intends to see Loghain at the sanatorium, because we later see Alan and Maxim arrive there to take Lan back because of the fire in the foregate. Alanna would not have known where to look for Lan if Lan had not told her, and if he did tell her, then he clearly already had plans to see Loghain at that time. This means he must have already known the concept of tied-off weaves. This narrows down when Lan could have received that information to the time window between right before Lan met Siuan and right after arriving in Cairhien. Finally, there's the scene in which Lan tells Rand how to remove the shield. Lan claims there's a story from the Age of Legends about the Forsaken's powers, a skill that's been lost for thousands of years, to tie off weaves and leave them in place. It never made sense to me, Moiraine. Which sounds like Lan has known about the story for a long time and is only now starting to make sense of it. This is where I think Lan is being a bit dishonest. The idea that Lan has known about the story, but neither Moiraine nor Adelias or Varen or anyone else who knew about Moraine's condition thought about it, is not very believable. Also, if he had known about the story, he would not earlier have spent so much time looking for alternative explanations, like a special type of weave. I think Lan is trying to cover up the fact that someone gave him that information, probably because he doesn't want Moiraine to know who his source is. Lan also may want to take some extra credit for this, just to demonstrate to Moiraine how valuable he is to her, so she takes him back as her warder. So who is his source? We don't know the exact person who talked to Lan, at least not for certain, but we can guess where the information originally came from. It would have to be someone who remembers tying off a weave from the Age of Legends, and who also has an interest in Moiraine getting her powers back. This means Lanfear. This also makes sense from another perspective. Lanfear clearly needs Moiraine to be able to channel once everyone gets to Falme. With all of the work Lanfear put into luring Moiraine to Cairhien and then stringing her along in her plans, we have to expect that Lanfear also had a plan in place to get Moraine's shield removed, because it would be out of character for Lanfear to leave such an important detail up to pure chance. It looks like this was her plan. Lanfear probably passed that information to Lan through an intermediary. Who is this intermediary? For that, let's look at a scene which at first sight seems completely unrelated, and that is Leandrin caring for his son Eludran when Lanfear arrives. Lanfear kills Eludran in order to remove the dependency Leandrin has on Ishamael, and then tries to recruit Leandrin to work for her instead of Ishamael. The scene ends before we find out whether Lanfear is successful in recruiting Leandrin. Another scene that seems to be related is this scene in episode 7 in which Leandrin orders Barthanes to kill his aunt Moiraine. Putting these two scenes together, we are apparently supposed to believe that Lanfear successfully recruited Leandrin and then told her to have Moiraine killed, and Leandrin now passes that order on to Barthanes to do the work for her. That explanation only works on the first watch of the season though, because later in the season, in episode 8, we find out that Lanfear lured Moiraine to Cairhien at the beginning of the season because Lanfear knew that she would need Moiraine at the end of the season. If Lanfear still needs Moiraine later, then why would Lanfear order to have Moiraine killed now? The answer is, Leandrin's order to have Moiraine killed could not have come from Lanfear. It probably came from Ishamael, and Leandrin may well have been serving two masters for a while, Ishamael and Lanfear. But if that is true, then we have two more questions. Why did Lanfear recruit Leandrin earlier? This means what order did Lanfear have for Leandrin? Also, why did Ishamael suddenly want Moiraine to be killed? Here's how I think all of this fits together. Lanfear had always planned to somehow pass information to Lan about the concept of tied-off weaves, because she knew that Moraine's shield had to be removed in order for Moiraine to be useful for her. She decided to use Leandrin as her intermediary, and that is why Lanfear recruited her. Lanfear simply told Leandrin to find an opportunity to talk to Lan and then tell Lan some story about tied-off weaves from the Age of Legends. That opportunity came after Lan had gone to see Siuan, and Siuan decided to go to Cairhien with 14 Aes Sedai, because Leandrin was one of those 14, so she would have spent some time traveling in the same group as Lan, and could have told Lan during the journey. There's the question whether Lan would have trusted Leandrin as a source of information, or whether he already knew at this time that she's Black Archer. Moiraine likely already knew, because the Leandrin chase scene at the beginning of Season 1 looks like it had specifically been set up by Moiraine to uncover Black Archer agents. I have talked about this in some of my earlier videos. However, Moiraine clearly did not tell Lan, because we know that at least in episode 4 of Season 1, Lan did not know that Leandrin is black, because otherwise he would have warned Nynaeve at that time, and then the three girls would never have been tricked into being abducted to Falme in Season 2. So it makes sense for Lan to believe Leandrin here. When Lan arrived in Cairhien, he already knew about Tide of Waves. Later, Ishamael found out about the plan to remove Moraine's shield, and realized that Moiraine could become a danger for him. He wanted Moiraine to be desperate, not able to channel, so when it became clear that she might become unshielded, he simply told Leandrin to have Moiraine killed. We don't know how Ishamael found out. It is possible that Leandrin betrayed Lanfear to Ishamael after first following Lanfear's orders. It is also possible that Ishamael found out by spying on Leandrin's or Lan's dreams. So it turns out that all three of these events are likely related to each other. Lanfear recruiting Leandrin, Leandrin ordering the killing of Moiraine, and Moiraine having her shield removed. So let's get back to the main storyline. While Moiraine has her shield removed and then opens the Waygate, Lyanna goes to Siuan, who immediately realizes that Lyanna has been tricked into passing Rand's shield to Verin, and that must mean that Moiraine has broken Rand out of his prison. What happens next is, in my opinion, the final nail in the coffin of the ruse theory for Siuan's behavior. Siuan now follows Moiraine and forces Moiraine to close the Waygate by commanding her through her oath of obedience. This is the part that makes no sense in the context of ruse theory. If Siuan's earlier behavior was really part of a ruse, and Moiraine and Siuan are still secretly working together, then it would make no sense for Siuan to follow Moiraine to the Waygate and force her to close it, because that would just permanently sabotage the common plan. Siuan has no way of knowing that Lanfear will arrive later and then reopen the Waygate again. If this was really all a ruse, then Siuan should simply have stayed on that city wall after Lyanna had arrived, pretending that she did not realize that Lyanna had been tricked. That's because by that point, any potential ruse had already played out, and there was no need to head for the Waygate. Meanwhile, Lanfear was on her way to the Sun Palace, intending to break out Rand, and then realized that someone else had already done it. She then headed for the Waygate, assuming that it was Moiraine who broke out Rand, with the intent of going to Falme. Lanfear arrives at the Waygate, and Siuan tries to attack her. Very brave, but also very useless, and Lanfear flicks her away like an annoying bug. Lanfear then pretends to be upset about seeing Moiraine and Rand together, but this is of course just for show, and she immediately backs down from her threat of harming Moiraine as soon as Rand protests. Lanfear decides to leave Siuan alive, which is interesting and something I will get back to later in this video. She then opens the Waygate, gets everyone inside, and leads them through the ways to the beach Waygate. At that point a rather interesting scene plays out. Moiraine asks Lanfear to open the Waygate, and then Lanfear turns this around and asks Moiraine to open the Waygate. Why would Lanfear do that if she later opens the Waygate herself anyway? The reason is that Lanfear is not absolutely sure that Moiraine has her powers back. Lanfear needs to know because she later needs Moiraine to channel for her. Lanfear probably suspects that Moiraine has her powers back because of the information she arranged for Lan to get, but Lanfear could not be sure. Moiraine at this point wants to hide the fact that she has her powers back, perhaps hoping that she might be able to surprise Lanfear later and try some Aes Sedai word trickery. Lanfear sees right through it and now suspects even more that Moiraine has her powers back, but still does not know for sure, so she now directly claims that she already knows that Moiraine has her powers back. This is of course a lie. If Lanfear really knew, then there would have been no need to ask Moiraine to open the Waygate in the first place. Also, from a lore perspective, even if Lanfear does have the talent to detect a woman's channeling ability, that ability should not look any different because of a Saidin shield, and Lanfear also cannot see the Saidin shield directly, so Lanfear should not be able to tell if the shield has been removed. Moiraine still does not respond, but now Lanfear interprets that non-response as an indication that Moiraine does have her powers back, because otherwise Moiraine would have protested. Next step in Lanfear's plans: open the beach Waygate, shove Moiraine and Lan out, tell Moiraine to be a good girl and use her banner weave at the right time, then close the Waygate again. With Mushin Chin now having appeared, Lanfear has to leave, so she teleports herself and Rand to Falme. Rand makes his way to the palace, close to the Damani kennels, and then sees Egwene as a Damani and follows her to the tower. Eventually, everyone on top of the tower dies, except for Egwene, and at that point Rand meets Egwene, and this is when the endgame with Ishamael starts. Meanwhile, Lanfear has a few final preparations to make. First, she needs to give Ishamael a good explanation why she brought Rand to Falme so much earlier than they had planned. She tries her best, insisting that Rand is ready, but Ishamael remains skeptical. The next item on Lanfear's list is to help Loial steal the Horn of Valere in her Selene persona. That's because she wants the good guys to win this fight, not the Seanchan who are, through Suroth, in an alliance with Ishamael. Next we get the scene that was the big reveal for Lanfear's motives this season, and this is when she talks to Baerdoman again to give him some repeat business. He's supposed to get ready to receive 6 big pieces of Quendulia, the 6 remaining Forsaken seals, which he is supposed to dump in the deepest part of the ocean, so Lanfear does not have to worry about competition from other Forsaken. This is when we find out that it was Lanfear who gave the Quendulia fragment to Baerdoman in episode 1, with the goal of luring Moiraine to Cairhien, so Moiraine could become an unknowing participant in Lanfear's plans. After that point, Lanfear's whereabouts are unknown until we see her again shortly before the end of the season in the crowd enjoying the show. I have some idea where Lanfear was in the meantime, and I'll get to that in a moment. Meanwhile, Moiraine and Lan have been making their way south along the beach until they get close to Falme, and Moiraine realizes that someone, likely Rand, is being shielded by channelers on nearby ships, so Moiraine decides to attack those ships. It is not clear how she gets past the third oath here, but I'm not really surprised that she does. Moiraine has always been able to twist her reasonings and motivations into a pretzel whenever necessary. The attack weave she uses creates a kind of fire column that she can steer from ship to ship through the weave. This is interesting because it means that the weave is not a fire and forget type of weave, but one that needs to be maintained throughout the attack, and we see her do that. After Rand has killed Ishamael, we return to Moiraine and Lan. Moiraine is still maintaining the attack weave when Lan tells her that the ships are retreating. Moiraine stops her attack, and we see the attack weave dissipate. Moiraine now remembers Lanfear's instructions and creates the dragon banner weave. Shortly before the weave reaches the tower, a large fireball coming from one of the Seanchan ships merges with Moraine's weave, and the result is the large dragon we see in the sky afterwards. The question is who created that fireball. I have seen 2 theories, and I believe both are wrong. One theory is that the Damani threw the fireball. That is unlikely though, because the Damani on the ships did not throw any fireballs at all during the whole fight, and that may in part be because they can't see what they would be shooting at because of the low elevation of the ships and the city wall around Falme that blocks the view. The second theory is that this fireball is the same fire column that Moiraine created earlier when attacking the ships. That also does not seem to be possible, because Moiraine dropped that attack wave several seconds earlier. So what is the answer then? The fireball must have been created by a channeler who is A. very powerful, B. able to appear on Seanchan ships, probably in disguise, and C. interested in helping Moiraine with her banner weave. The only person who fits all of these criteria is Lanfear, so I think it is her who creates that fireball. This also explains where Lanfear was in between talking to Baerdoman and appearing in the crowd later. She teleported to one of the Seanchan ships, probably disguised as a soldier, waited until Moiraine cast her banner weave, and then created a fireball to merge with that weave to make the dragon look more impressive. One more scene involving Lanfear. The final loose end she has to tie up is to get those 6 seals to Baerdoman. To her surprise, when she gets into the room, the seals are already broken and Moghedien is in the room. We then find out that the remaining 6 Forsaken have all been released, and Moghedien is apparently being set up as an adversary for Lanfear in Season 3. 2 more notes before I wrap up. First, there are interesting parallels between Season 1 and Season 2, especially regarding the character arcs of Moiraine and Lanfear. In Season 1, Moiraine is the character who has the deepest schemes and plots, and all of them succeed until the very end when she is stopped by Ishamael. In Season 2, the same thing happens for Lanfear. She controls most of the major events in Season 2, many of them secretly, and she too is stopped at the very end by Ishamael. Second, I'd like to go back to the scene right before Lanfear takes the group through the Waygate. Talking to Siuan, she says, "Lucky for you, a broken Emerald is more useful to me than a dead one." I believe by broken she does not mean that Siuan is physically broken or broken in spirit, but that her will is broken because of the compulsion Lanfear placed on her. This will likely become very interesting once Siuan is back in the tower and we have one of the Forsaken in a position to influence events in the tower. I can't wait to see what kind of storylines the writers will create from that in Season 3. We're getting to the end of this video. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and please join me again for other videos on this channel. Also please like, subscribe and leave comments. The description of this video has links for all source material used in the creation of the video. Thanks again, and that's it for now.